Okay, so before I go into how I got to psychology from biology, which I'm imagining you've heard many times students do, I will start with who I am today. I'm a community psychologist in the Department of Psychology. Now, what is community psychology? It's a subfield within psychology that focuses on defining and addressing social problems, right? Psychology has been an applied field since the early 20th century. Before that, it was a basic science, right? Interested in the mind-body connection. And then there was a need grounded in context for the application of psychological research and knowledge to support individuals. And that's even grounded in this frame of Darwin and the idea of survival of the fittest. And so psychology could be used in order to support individuals to thrive and survive, right? Now, community psychology didn't come around till much later, because although psychology recognized the necessity of its application, it didn't appreciate problems beyond the level of the individual, right? And so when we looked, early psychologists looked at problems in society, they tended to point at individual level factors that were predictive of differential outcomes, right? And so, and moreover, the conceptualization was that there were individual differences, and they were grounded in the biology of the individual. And none of those individual outcomes that people experienced were related to the environments in which they existed, right? And so somewhere around the mid-20th century, community psychology was born kind of out of necessity, right? And as a result of systemic factors, this recognition of the World War and how World War II in particular, and how there was a beginning recognition of the fact that there were systemic factors that were predicting poor outcomes amongst individuals across the globe. And that we weren't going to turn around and say, it must be the individual. Moreover, veterans were impacted by the situations in which they found themselves. And we were going to define those problems at the level of the individual, or are we going to recognize that there were contextual factors that were predicting PTSD in these individuals? Moreover, we were still seeing, in spite of the application of psychology, right, we were still seeing poor outcomes. And so these tools that psychology was providing to the community, to the society, weren't necessarily reducing the incidence and prevalence of poor outcomes. And moreover, modernity was we were moving away from this idea of modernity. Scholars were starting to think more postmodernistic. And as a result of that, we were starting to realize individual difference was associated with factors higher than the individual, thank goodness. And so community psychology, over the course of the second half of the 20th century, began to, as a result of really advocacy groups and other grassroots organizations, started to appreciate different frames, different lenses through which to think about individual outcomes. When I'm talking about individual outcomes, I'm talking about things like depression or low well-being, more broadly speaking, or things like poverty, higher systemic problems that tended to be defined at the level of the individual. And also differences in experiences of identities that were starting to be challenged by these grassroots organizations, right? And so we can think about the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, movements for individuals with disabilities. All those movements were huge in the 60s, resulting in kind of this conference where community psychologists came together and said, we need to start looking up. Right? And so different frameworks, diversity and social frameworks were embraced. Community psychology also embraces the idea of prevention, thinking about systemic factors that increase risk or resilience in the context of variable and challenging systemic forces, which then would either exacerbate or reduce poor outcomes for individuals. Participatory action research, this idea that we're not in search of the savage when we're engaging in research, right? But that we are engaging communities to find out what they think their problems are. Not from this ivory tower of saying, oh, I'm the expert, I know what the problems are, I'm gonna go in and be the hero. No, engaging with communities and understanding that they know what is in their best interest, and it's culturally contextual, these contexts, and they are the experts of those contexts. And then ecological models, which I'm gonna elaborate on over the course of this lecture. I've been a faculty since 2008 in the Department of Psychology, but I've been a member of the DePaul community since 2004. I got my PhD here. I've done research here. I've never left here. At DePaul, as Carolyn said, I've done research on well-being and context. I've really explored this idea of cultural competence and rigor and the connection between cultural competence and rigor. And I've trained clinical psychology students at the doctoral level, undergraduate experiential students who work in service. And then I also teach psychopathology and qualitative research methods. And then I've done, most recently, DEI work for DePaul. And so through the next 35 minutes, I'll be talking about my positionality, positionality more broadly, and ecological models. I'll talk about the impact of interdisciplinary work and cultural competence through this lens of ecological models, and then I'll talk about my current research. So, positionality, right? I was asked to come to kind of talk about who I am and what my journey has been. But I was really excited about being asked that because it allows me to offer up a framework of positionality. Positionality is really important, I think, across all disciplines, all those disciplines that engage in research, all those disciplines that may potentially apply that research. Positionality is about worldview. And it's interesting that in science, right, there is this assumption of objectivity. Right? And positionality directly challenges this idea of objectivity. And I don't want to go into a philosophical conversation, but we could have a philosophical conversation about epistemological frameworks or ideas that kind of promote this idea of objectivity and the role that positionality plays in that. But for the purposes of this lecture, I'll talk about positionality as it relates to the work I've done. And so it refers to worldview and how differences in social position and power shape identities and access in society, right? So social positions. And social positions tend to be, in our society, grounded in identity, right? Gender, sex, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. Predicts our access. It has for centuries, really. So we've come to appreciate that positionality is important in the work that we do. So I have a couple of quotes. It's important in teaching, clinical, and research practice. So we've come to appreciate in the last 70 years or so that positionality in research reflects the position that the researcher has chosen to adopt within a given research study. It influences both how research is conducted, its outcomes and results, right? There's a study by Sampson, 1998, where Sampson talks about this idea of the utility of us as a field. Given that we tend to conduct research through a specific lens that doesn't appreciate, that assumes that the identity of the researcher matches that of the population to some extent. And if it veers, outcomes veer from that of the population, then what factors might contribute to those differences? Well, we hadn't been really considering factors outside of the individual, right? And so what we would do was we tended to engage in comparison research, where we have our perspectives and viewpoints, and then we see the behaviors of others, and then ask ourselves, compare and contrast ourselves from the individuals we're researching and not taking into consideration or putting our shoes into the positions of those individuals, but really seeing these contexts as similar. And that's kind of the perspective of modernity more generally, that there's one way to do things, that there isn't a relativity piece, there isn't a subjective piece, it's all objective. And so someone's subjective experience isn't necessarily considered. A lot of the outcomes that we were seeing in other populations were the result of our own viewpoints and values. So for example, if an individual is engaging in homosexuality per the Diagnostic Manual 3, which we're now on 5, luckily, but 3, then they were engaging in maladaptive behavior that required intervention, right? So that's basically what I'm talking about. This idea of the way we identified homosexuality was through a lens of pathology. I'm in a heteronormative society, sexual orientation beyond heteronormativity is seen as pathological and not taking context into consideration when identifying individuals who identify and understanding individuals that identify as homosexual, appreciating that's the context that's causing distress and dysfunction, not something innate within the individual. Also, thinking about how to work with individuals that, let's use this example of homosexuality. In working with, so beyond the research and engaging in clinical practice, what we do, we diagnose the individual and send them to therapy in order for them to better engage in heteronormative behaviors, as opposed to seeing the person through the lens of their own experience and appreciating the diversity of identity is not a source of pathology, but actually a source of diversity. So once his social, historical, political, and cultural context shape their self-identity, how one is in relation to others and how one understands and views themselves in relation to the world. Again, this idea of critical consciousness, right? That's Freire, Paulo Freire. And the idea of critical consciousness. Over the last 70 years or so in the field of psychology, we've come to become more critical, thinking about history, historical frameworks for understanding current conditions of individuals who vary based on identity, and understanding contemporary systems and how they predict the experience of others. So really taking a nurture approach to understanding behavior as compared to a nature approach. And it's interesting, it's evolved until we understand it's both, right? But ignoring that nurture piece was a real problem in the field. And so again, I mentioned this postmodern concept. This whole idea of positionality challenges that. All right, so about me, my positionality. I recognize I'm not special. Okay? I say that to my students every time I teach oppression and privilege. We are none of us special. We're born into systems, and systems determine who has power and who doesn't. As soon as you're born, depending on where you're born and what year you're born, it determines, has a lot of impact on your experience, right? And so if this was 1964, I would not be standing here, right? I probably wouldn't have a PhD, and I wouldn't be talking about this, right? So I am not special, but my early experiences, I've come to reflect, have really had a reciprocal and dynamic relationship with where I am today. So my early experiences absolutely fostered an interest in understanding behavior. I was raised in an environment where I saw a lot of children experience harm, abuse, and neglect. And I had a very altruistic parent who fostered many children. And so through those experiences, I came to question why people do what they do. Seemingly really nice people that are doing not so nice things. And I grew up kind of chronically in these environments. Moreover, I gained a critical consciousness through the fact that I'm biracial, right? And it's interesting, critical consciousness or critical analysis is kind of forced on historically oppressed populations, as compared to privilege, where you don't really have to pay attention that much because you're not kind of met with challenges as it relates to your ability to have power, to access. Mind you, children are disempowered as well. And so just being a child alone kind of makes you ask yourself some questions about why you can't have something or not, or why things are the way they are. I asked myself a lot of questions as a biracial child raised in the 70s. Okay, I wanted to understand why I was treated differently in homogenous settings. And so all of those questions led me toward an interest in behavior, but I thought I wanted to go through the biology medical school route to psychiatry, and through experiential learning, I came to understand I didn't have to do it that way, and that might not be the best way for me. I also received messages about my abilities as it relates to identity from my immediate family. So I had high expectations. High expectations are predictors of high outcomes, if you will. So when your parents have high expectations, when teachers have high expectations for you, when they just assume you're going to be successful, which mine did. My parents thought I was going to be anything I wanted to be. And they told me, oh, you're going to college. I mean, is there any question? Where I've worked with youth who are like, college? I'm not going to college. Right? The messages they receive from teachers is, I don't think you should go that way. I always got the absolutely go as far as you're going to go because you're just so smart, right? And that's what I heard. Moreover, I wanted to make my parents proud. Sarah Ahmad wrote a text called The Pursuit of Happiness. And no, it's not a self-help book. The Pursuit of Happiness offers cultural frames for understanding what messages we receive about what being happy means and how those messages are very grounded in your identity, right? So for women, oftentimes you hear this idea of, happiness means getting married. Happiness means having a wedding. Happiness means all these different things grounded in your identity. And when children come to their parents and say, Mom, Dad, I identify as LGBT, they say, oh, but I just want you to be happy, because they're concerned about the idea of the impact society is going to have on you, grounded in you not maintaining the status quo in terms of your identity. I also had access to resources. I had access to private schooling, albeit homogeneous in terms of race and religion. I had small classes and contemporary learning materials. But I also was discriminated against the entire time I was in elementary school. And even in high school, where I was told I was acting white, right? And I almost didn't make it out of high school because I rebelled against the idea that I wasn't embraced by the Black community. And so, okay, I won't talk this way like school, embrace these honors classes. And so I checked out for about a year and almost didn't finish high school. And even though, again, I was attending honors classes and was told by many teachers how intelligent I was. But I got a book from a teacher called Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And it was an advanced class that I was teaching, and she was a bold teacher. And she offered us the whole class this book, and offering that class was my first taste of what it meant to be a Black woman and how that was a good thing and that was okay, and that I could be smart and be a Black woman. And then Toni Morrison reinforced that, and then Malcolm X reinforced that. And I was starting to engage in reading materials that kind of reinvigorated my interest in education and learning, and started to develop my sense of identity, of being mixed race, of being intelligent, of being a woman. And I attended undergrad. And during this time, the reason why I decided to major in biology is because I was going to become a psychiatrist. I thought that's the way to go. And I wasn't confident in psychology in terms of the research methods that they used. I assumed that, as many people do, that the biological sciences, the natural sciences, were the better way to go in terms of really gaining empirical understanding of, how things work, how the body works, how the mind works. And so I was a biology major for a long time, a couple years. And I was sitting in an honors meeting with my honors faculty. And she said, how's it going? And I said, I'm just waiting to get to behavior. And she's like, well, you're gonna be waiting a long time. Are you sure? And I'm like, yes, because I want to make my parents proud. That back to the pursuit of happiness, Sarah Ahmad, I want to make my parents proud. A lot of students end up majoring in things to make their parents proud, but it's not their interest necessarily. It just looks and sounds good, right? And the honors mentor said, no, do what you like. So I asked my dad, I said, if I don't, go the medical school route, are you going to be disappointed? And he said, no, do what you love. So what I did was I did both. I engaged in biomedical or psychopharmacological research on Tuesdays and Thursdays, running PCR, and not really enjoying myself, and then running to Jane Addams Hull House to do experiential work in the community. Now, I would run to Jane Addams. So that's telling you something. I would tiptoe to the lab to do PCR, right? And so it was through experience. That's how I'm trying to make my point. It was through experience in college, experiential learning, that I came to understand my purpose and passion. And moreover, back then, thinking ecologically, my education was affordable, right? I was the generation right before the spike. And so when I entered the field of psychology proper, when I entered grad school in 2005, I noticed, because ultimately I did major in psychology in undergrad. I did switch majors. I did end up getting a bachelor's degree in applied psychology, and I did end up going to grad school. But before that, I gained even more experience. And it was through those experiences in between undergrad and grad school that I came to know my calling. And how did that happen? It happened because I worked in community, and I came to understand that I was undertrained. I was particularly undertrained in cultural competence. I was particularly undertrained in understanding my power and the power of systems and how they had an impact on individuals, not just the individuals. I assumed we would look and try to help people with their problems, not recognizing the systems were problematic as well. There's research being done, it's been in the works for a while now, at Northwestern and Loyola, where they're looking at DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, clinical department, if you will. And they came to understand it was broken. Moreover, when I was working for the Department of Children and Family Services, I came to understand that children were being harmed under the care of these services, that they were better off before they came into the system than they were when they got out, right? And so all of these things are, and I had no knowledge of what to do about it. And I felt powerless in these systems. So I wanted to move up to higher systems and gain higher power to be able to make a difference. And so I came into graduate school kind of knowing exactly what I wanted to do, which is so important. Because you won't get out if you don't know. It's just too darn complicated. You gotta really have a sense, because those moments when you just want to quit, it's that sense of purpose that's gonna keep you going. And so I came in knowing I was gonna be a teacher. I literally walked in with the opportunity to be a clinician, with the opportunity to be a researcher, with the opportunity to be a director. I knew I was going to teach for many reasons, which I'll describe. And so, interestingly, and thinking ecologically, which you'll see the ecological model in a minute, as I was changing, so was the field. Thank goodness, right? We were coming to know that we needed to change. Thank goodness. I walked into a field where there were very few studies, there still are, on Black and brown youth, Black and brown people generally. And when we were studying them, we were defining their problems at the level, or the problems they were experiencing at the level of the individual, for sure. There's a classic article by Kaplan and Nelson, my favorite article of all time, that's entitled On Being Useful. It literally reinforced my motivation to do this work. This idea that psychology can't be, the reason why we tend to define problems at the level of the individual, particularly around marginalized populations, is because of the law of the instrument, the idea that we have a hammer, we're looking for nails, right? We're not looking up, we're a field that started with the idea of the individual. Also, ethnocentric perspectives. I mentioned that before, that we tend to look through our own worldview when we're studying others, as opposed to kind of asking others about their worldview. And also the idea of biased research, the idea of the hypothesis, the questions we ask ourselves even are grounded in our own worldview about what we think why people do what they do, right? And so that can really pose problems in terms of gaining a rigorous understanding of behavior and then being able to generalize it. So internal validity and external validity play a role there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the absence of diversity across the field is another reason I became a faculty. I have problems with internal and external validity, so I'll elaborate on it. So absence of diversity across the field. And so one of the problems with the field is that we were doing laboratory research, right? Trying to isolate all the variables and enhance internal validity, right? But then is it generalizable? If I want to understand depression and my sample is undergraduate college students, then how is that going to be generalizable to individuals over 65? How is that going to be generalizable to single moms? How is that going to be generalizable to other populations, right? And so this need to kind of ask questions and create hypotheses that are grounded in a consideration of multiple variables. And technology, advances in statistics have allowed us to do that, to consider multiple variables that contribute to the variance in outcomes. Also, blaming the victim is another issue that we were doing in the field. Absolutely, that Kaplan and Nelson article I referenced. Kaplan and Nelson offered that when they reviewed the literature of over the last 20, 30, 40 years, what they found was that when they were looking at populations that were historically marginalized, like Black populations, they would define the problems at the person-centered. And when they looked at other populations around the same outcome variable, they would look at situation-centered factors, right? So looking at problems within the individual tends to blame the individual for the circumstances they find themselves in. I'll give you an example. The violence against women. For the last 100 years, we've been defining violence against women as a women's problem. And we create interventions, we create programs, we engage in all kinds of activity to support the woman that's experienced violence. But who are the perpetrators of the violence? And should we not consider the socialization of those populations when thinking about violence against women? And then this idea of critical consciousness in action. I gained through this graduate experience access to diverse disciplines that helped me to better support the population that I was interested in. So I talked about person versus situation-centered definitions of social problems. And I offer two examples that kind of highlight this notion. I gave the one about the violence against women, but also the opioid addiction. It's a social problem. How are we defining that problem? At what level are we defining that problem, right? Are we defining it at the level of the individual, saying, oh, these individuals are just undermotivated, or it's a dopaminergic issue, right? We reduce it to the individual, not just the individual, but mechanisms within the individual. But what about the mechanisms within systems like the big pharma? What role do they play in opioid addiction? And so ecological models offered by Brofenbrenner in 1979 really helped the field to conceptualize various ways to define social problems. And so here's the model, Brofenbrenner's ecological model. And I love this. An undergrad student sent this to me in the middle of the quarter because it had a model that actually included a youth of color and what they experience grounded in the context that they exist in. And of course, we're not a monolith, right? But this is just a hypothetical kid that exists in a hypothetical microsystem. And within that microsystem, hypothetical teachers talk to hypothetical parents about how the kid is doing. And that is in the context of an indirect system called the exosystem that also has an indirect impact on the well-being of the child. And I bring back that idea of the kid who identifies as LGB, right? That depending on the year that they identify as LGB, you are going to see different experiences or different policies, different applications in support or against that child that identifies as LGB. Or that child that's in a segregated school or not, as in the case of this youth right here. And so the Brofenbrenner model is groundbreaking in the work of human ecology. And the ecology is the science of the relationship between the organism and their environment. And so it takes context into consideration, which the field wasn't doing. And so I just offer up just a little bit about each system. The microsystem is the immediate environment. And remember, we're coming to really appreciate the development is across the lifespan. So it's not just the child that experiences these systems, it's adults that experience these systems as well. So the immediate environment, the interconnections between microsystems, like a parent and child. Dr. Susan McMahon is doing research on teacher interactions with parents, teacher-parent relationships, and how they can be strained in certain communities, grounded in lack of trust and grounded in historical experiences with teachers, of parents with their own teachers, and how those relationships strain, and then we see an intergenerational, interpersonal style that can be challenging and that can disrupt the quality of education received by a child. The exosystem, things like media, not social media, because social media is within the microsystem, but other types of media that tell us what beautiful is, that tell us what we should eat, that we should buy cell phones, and what it means to be happy. And then the larger social context, the larger cultural context that predicts a lot of policies, that predicts the narrative that that comes to take up space in our subconscious about what is expected of us and how we're supposed to perform. And so this theory, I know you've seen these models all over, really built bridges and supported an integrative approach between different disciplines and understanding behavior. And so I'm going to show you a couple models that kind of exemplify the strength of Bronfenbrenner's model and how it helped us get to a space where we take an integrated approach that we pull from many different disciplines and their understandings and their reductionism of pieces of the human experience and how they can come together for us to better understand behavior, so that child psychologists are just thinking about children in a bubble, and political science is only thinking about politics in a bubble, but that we're doing it all together. This is an adaptation of Bronfenbrenner's ecosystemic model for crisis. Prior to this model, and it's not because of this model, it's just the use of this model, that FEMA, local and governmental agencies are doing a better job of supporting individuals in crisis than they did pre-Katrina. Do you remember what happened with Katrina? Services, buses, all kinds of supportive care was not in place. They weren't communicating on the same system, and a lot of people got hurt. So as a result of that, they went back in and tried to figure out a way to enhance communication across disciplines. You can imagine that in a crisis situation, you need the help of many different agencies and disciplines and organizations in order to support the individual at the center. And so you can see in this model, we have many different mesosystems, that communication system that support the well-being of individuals. This is the American Psychological Association's multicultural guidelines, which helped us to better understand that we were harming people, that we were in the ivory tower, that we were owning our own positionality and power, and that in fact we were not effectively serving the needs of individuals. And so we weren't training our clinicians to work with diverse populations. We weren't helping our researchers, training our researchers to understand their positionality. And we really had homogenous interventions that were never sampled on diverse populations. I mean, just a hot mess. And so over the last couple of decades, I remember the APA conference where everybody was fighting about who's more marginalized than whom, thinking about historically marginalized populations. And we got so far to here where you can see that there are multiple levels in which we take into consideration that are important in understanding how to best help individuals. And then this is a model for an intervention that I conducted where I was interested in supporting a school district in transitioning students from a segregated school to general schools all over the city, and what needed to be in place at higher systems level, not focusing on individual change, but on systems change to be more inclusive and support belonging. And so with all of this, I think it's important to consider a number of things. That there's not one way, right, to think about understanding wellness. There are many ways. that Bronfenbrenner's ecological model offers a holistic frame for thinking about well-being, while also being reductionistic at the same time. That we can think of what's going on in the microsystem at a very reductionistic level, right? And think about the dynamic interactions between parent and child, or the dynamic interactions between school and child. But then we can also think about policy, how that affects schools and teachers, which ultimately affects kids. And so different studies can be conducted to understand these social problems while taking into consideration the reciprocal and dynamic interaction of systems in affecting outcomes. I talked about internal validity and external validity. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because we don't have time. But then all of this, and particularly that APA model, speaks about cultural competence and this idea that we are not objective. And then it's really important for us to take our viewpoint and worldview into consideration, and also gain the voices of those individuals that tell their story about what their experience is, about what depression looks like for them, right? About what well-being looks like for them. And then this idea that it's connected to rigor and it's connected to ethics in the idea of doing no harm. Skip this slide. And so in academia here at DePaul, in the work I'm doing here at DePaul, I'm working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is brought about by an initiative to retain students that were struggling to stay here at DePaul because they didn't feel a sense of belonging and inclusion, and to provide services and support systems that embrace all individuals. And you see the definitions of each: diversity, commitment to increasing diversity. I can't tell you how many students in my focus group talked about the fact that they don't identify with their faculty, that they don't see faculty that look like them. And so the main purpose of my project through the College of Science and Health Administration was to spend some time with Black and Latinx youth here at DePaul and ask them about their experience and perspective. Why? To gain multiple perspectives, because we are administrators and faculty. We have power. We have a perspective, a worldview about how things are going. But what about their perspective, and how can that help us to create interventions or to create a community, a culture that's supportive? And so we collected data, we analyzed it over the summer, and we're disseminating it over this next year. But really, the focus groups really helped us to enhance our understanding of what inclusion and equity and diversity look like for students, in the interest of pooling that with other data in order to be useful to them here at DePaul. That's it. I had to talk so fast because I'm really long-winded, so I will have you here for like a really long time. So I apologize for rushing it, but I got through it in a decent amount of time.
That's the question.
Yeah.
So you're uniquely positioned because you came from biology to psychology. You talked about bridges between psychology and other places. There was no psychology biology bridge up there. So
True.
Where are we in terms of from psychology towards biology and other other areas within sciences, right? Where are we in terms of that? So I study non-animal human behavior. Okay. So to me, there's lots of overlap there's quite a bit of work on how someone identifies as a male, someone as a female may watch the same. I work on sexual conflicts, so male-female contests, things like this, can look at the exact same thing and interpret it completely differently based on what they're seeing from the same interaction. And so I do a thing in my class where I show a video to take away what's being said about it, because what's being said is the male is doing this, and you get different perspectives on what's happening based on it looking at it, right? So there's probably quite a lot of bridge and overlap there. I'm just curious have you seen much overlap with bio, non-human, human kind of things?
Well, it's interesting. Your research is interesting also. I have questions for you. But what made me think of is neuroscience. It's as close as I'm gonna get for a specific example. So I'm teaching advanced psychopathology this quarter, right? Psychopathology is really like abnormal psychology. We're trying not to say abnormal psychology anymore. And so I teach it to the doctoral students. And we have been talking about changes in the diagnostic statistical manual for diagnosing behaviors. Would you believe it or not that the current diagnostic manual is really constructed of qualitative understandings of pathology? So it's just groupings. It's not grounded in any disease model, which is problematic, right? And so we know that it's problematic because it really is on a continuum. Pathology is really normalcy across a spectrum, right? Behavior doesn't go in categories, even though we categorize everything, right? And so, because the NIMH is doing research to consider a couple of things. This idea of developmental, this idea of the diathesis stress. So diathesis is genetic predisposition, and we understand that nature, nurture. Stress is environment. And we've come to appreciate, or neuroscientists have come to appreciate, that the transcription of genes during that process of gene transcription within the human experience or body, there's a methylation. There's this methylizing, this linking, this labeling of a transcription that then alters expression, right? The phenotype, the expression, the behavior, right? And then it's like epigenetics, right? And so we're coming to appreciate that this connection between genes and environment and are real at the reduced level, at the neurochemical level, which is, we've been looking for this, right? We've been looking to understand this connection. How does it work that environment changes us? I knew it because I did some trauma research. And in the trauma research, we really were uncovering this idea that, there was apoptosis, there was damage to the brain when trauma occurs. So wait a minute, environment does change the brain, if you will, but it gets deeper than that, deeper than I even understand it. And so we call it RDoc through the NIMH, just this program that's using this information to help us better understand behavior and abnormality, if you will, and kind of tying that to developmental trajectories and epigenetics. And so I absolutely honor the relationship between biology and psychology in helping us understand, which the most thing I care about is well-being. Others? Yeah.
So one question is, from your perspective, what are things that you think can be done like kind of fairly immediately, and then that are important, and things that are important to start to do over the long term that you see as fundamental for increasing student retention? Issues with students that come and for whatever reason they're not doing well. Good.
So I left out because I was rushing, right? I left out how it was that undergrad supported my sense of belonging and my sense of efficacy, academic self-efficacy, and efficacy for the plan that I was making for my young life. And part of that was mentoring. I had my biology professor, Dr. Zinzer. If it weren't for Dr. Zinzer in Bio 102, I literally don't think I would be here either. I would have given up. I would have. It was so hard. I was taking calculus and physics and I was taking really hard courses and too many. And someone mentored me. And even the findings from our data is mentoring is huge. And I think that the college is taking up the recommendations, not just from my study, because qualitative is just confirmatory. You don't base changes in policy grounded in qual, right? But what our findings confirm is that mentoring is huge. It was met, and Dr. Linda Sagrestano, I did my first research at UIC with Dr. Linda Sagrestano. Had I not done that research with Linda Sagrestano, I don't know that I would have been able to see myself beyond the classroom, which I had to be perfect at, right? Students want to feel a sense of efficacy. And I have interviewed students who talk about this idea that once they connected with the faculty, that the sky was the limit, and they thought, this is not what I thought it was so hard. It is hard, but everything is hard, if you will. And getting a model and seeing, like, people see me and think, I could do it. I get that a lot. People have gone to grad school grounded in just talking to me because they're like, she could do it, I could do it. And I think that's huge. Another piece is diverse faculty. Dr. Hart out of Columbia University does research, back to biology in your question, does research on substance misuse, particularly crack addiction, and trying to understand, and cocaine addiction, and trying to understand the underpinnings of it. And Hart was actually someone who, as an adolescent, engaged in substance abuse, went to jail, got out of jail, went to undergrad, got a PhD in neuroscience, and wanted to go back and understand what happened, why, what happened. It must be that the drug is so strong. And what they found through rat studies and other studies was that if you have an alternative reinforcer, an alternative opportunity, an alternative stimulus that's going to trigger dopamine, like a partner or some other reward that in combination with the drug, then you are less likely to use the drug. And that is why in the context of poor environments, we see poor outcomes. And we're incarcerating all these individuals saying it's the drug and you're peddling it, so you need to go to jail. But in fact, it was poverty that was exacerbating the outcomes, poor outcomes for individuals that were consuming. And so Dr. Hart is somebody who experienced in life the types of things that he was researching. So it's a multiple perspective. And students call for diverse faculty. And I acknowledge that not having diverse faculty makes them feel like it's not for them, that they're not supposed to be at the level of the knower. Yeah.
Do you have any, specific advice for, I'm an undergrad student, but any students in general in terms of finding that sort of purpose that you were talking about? I know you said that it took you a while, and luckily once you got into graduate school, you found that purpose, but I don't know, just kind of, there's a lot of options for me personally right now. And I know that purpose really does drive you when you're feeling down about your studies. So I kind of just, if you'd like to, if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Totally. It was really before grad school. I don't think I would have gotten in grad school. It's so hard to get in grad school. I don't know that I would have gotten in if I hadn't had a clear vision for how I could get where I wanted to be, which was graduated in a faculty at an institution like this. It was through experiential learning. I teach social justice. I teach Psych 305. Psychology and social justice, and it's an experiential learning course. So students go out into community and they engage with community members. I can't tell you enough about how much I learned in community. I learned everything in community, and then I brought it back. I took that knowledge and brought it to academia. So it really is experiential. It's not just experiential learning in terms of working in community. It's also working in labs. I had to work in a lab. Studying, the hippocampus and rhesus monkeys, and understanding the benzodiazepines. That's the research I was doing. I had to do it to know it wasn't for me at all. In fact, I was loading a gel and I was electrocuting myself. Not to say that just because you're loading a gel and electrocuting yourself means that you shouldn't do the work. I'm just saying that I just didn't see it for me, but I tried it on, and being willing to fail. I literally took molecular micro, I literally took biochem, I literally took physiology with medical students at UIC. I did all those things, and I'm stubborn. So I had to keep plugging away until I was convinced that this wasn't for me, and it wasn't gonna be for me. And so you have to be willing to, and the other thing is, a student said this to me in my focus groups, and I agree with them. You gotta push to get help. Like, you have to ask for help. You have to be humble enough to be like, I don't get it, or I don't understand, or I need Dr. Zinsser. I look for Dr. Zinsser still to this day because I want him to know that if it wasn't for him, saying, yes, I will help you, that I wouldn't be where I am today. It almost makes me choked up. So honestly, asking for help, being tenacious, optimism, it's a quality of optimism, it's tenacity. And so you gotta do it. You gotta say, what do I have to lose? Everything to gain by trying things on that don't work, and accessing help from multiple places. And the more experience you gain, the more your vita or your resume looks like you know what you're doing in terms of gaining critical awareness. That's my.
So I'm going to follow up from both of those comments, actually, this notion of success. You talked about the importance of how you think about success, especially in terms of your parents.
Mhm.
And that's often a real challenge, right? Because we get our pre-meds, so they start off as pre-meds, they may not end up as pre-meds, but that transition from I'm pre-med now, and maybe I don't really want to be pre-med, and how are my parents going to respond? And so it seems like that success defining transition and being mentored through that and supported, right, becomes
Yes.
critical.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily something that we talk about that much, right? The
Yes.
success definition transition and
Yes.
supporting, but that may be, like, it's more scary to move, who am I going to disappoint if I don't do what everyone thinks I'm going to do? And so I'm going to stay here and stay stubborn on it, right?
Absolutely,
Right.
and feel less and less efficacious to do anything if you're really talking about it. That's why Sarah Ahmad's book is huge. I mean, when I picked up that book, and really I picked it up to teach it, right? Because it was part of my multiculturalism course, and that idea, it was like a eureka moment. I was already past undergrad. I was already past all these milestones, and I went right back there to how important, and we don't talk about this as faculty, how important it is for us to make our parents proud. We've all been there. That's the beautiful thing about talking about these types of topics, particularly in the context of our own development. We've all been there. That one of the major reasons why most of my applied psych students want a PhD in psychology isn't because they like research, because they don't. Is they want to make their parents proud. And talking through that, even in our intro courses, I talk about it in social justice and applied psych, because I'm trying to teach them to really be rigorous and culturally competent. And so I'm like, it's not that I'm saying, yeah, y'all are not going to be PhDs. You could totally be that. You don't have to be that for them. You have to be, because you don't realize it. I didn't either, but you have the rest of your life. You have no idea how your parents' perceptions change. You know, what motivates you changes. And so I think it should be said amongst faculty to students.
But we know that. But when you're 18, you don't.
I know.
Right? And so-
I know.
Right, and so we have a class we're working for bio, which is for freshmen. And one of the things is about success, how you define success. And then how you move into your own version of what success really is versus what maybe in high school is seen, high school's like AP and honors and right? As opposed to what are you really doing and why are you doing it?
Yeah.
But that's another thing to do when you're a freshman taking physics, biology, chemistry, calculus, right?
And it was painful.
And that's a
Yes.
different kind of thinking to get those things done and everything else and work my job and everything else, right?
Yeah, but I'll add that Brofenberner's model offers that. I feel for parents. I'm a parent, and the narrative that we understand, the narrative that we get from society is similar to what our children get. Meaning, a successful parent has successful children. And what is success? It's performance, and it's not healthy, right? That we're performers instead of peace and serenity is hard to come by if you're constantly looking outward for validation of who you are. That's another psychological concept that we could spend some time talking about. And that's why Brofenberner's model is so useful for every last one of us. Understanding that we are impacted by the narrative of our larger ideology of individualism, of this idea of even survival of the fittest, if you will. And I think it takes some time for us to hopefully recognize that our worth is not grounded in outside forces, even our parents.
Thinking about you saying earlier about who you look to solve the problem, right? So the students who've got this from their families, and we try to help the student fix themselves. It's almost like maybe before the students come to college, we talk to the parents.
Yes, yes,
Because
absolutely.
if the safety net is in place, that, okay, I may not go the way you want me to go.
Yes.
That's gonna be cool, right?
Yes.
Because they don't know, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe we're gonna, I don't know.
I will
Think
tell
on the
you,
fly.
I will tell you, had I not had exposure to traumas that made me think, okay, in order to be okay, I have to understand behavior, I would have been a fashion editor. That was what I liked. Do you understand what I'm saying? So oftentimes students aren't critically conscious of the quality of their interests and how they matter, not just as, particularly students of color. They all go into, a lot of students of color will say, okay, worthiness, medical school, worthiness, law school. But what about some other profession that is underrepresented and you love it, right? And so these pigeonhole categories that we say we see success as, it's problematic. And so maybe in high school, we should be having discussions about what it means to be useful, what it means to be worthy. And sky's the limit in terms of your interest. Because matching strength, like I teach, I'm good at it, right? I'm not, people say I'm a good leader, but I'm not a good leader. I don't want to lead. I'd rather be behind the scenes, honestly. So I'm not going to be the director. I made a conscious decision when I finished, when I got my doctorate, that I could be a clinic, I could be all these different things. But what I was really good at, what my mentor like sat at the back of the class and was like, oh, that's it, that's your thing, you know, and that's enough for me. You know what I'm saying? And thinking about the balance of life as well.
Question on Zoom.
Kenji.
Yeah, the time it's overtime, so very quickly. I have one burning question.
Okay.
Was that Roger Zinser at UIC
Yes!
bias 102?
Yes.
Guess
that
what?
is-
Guess what? I taught by 102 for 5 years under Dr. Roger Zinser. So
Dr. Zinser is everything awesome. I promise you, I think about Dr. Zinser often. Do you know where Dr. Zinser is by any chance?
I have no idea.
I have searched high and low for Dr. Zinser. So what a blessing that you are bringing this up right now. Thank you for that. That kind of made my day. I'm just going to tell you. So you know, the reward for this was you saying that.
And thank you for the great talk.
All right, awesome. This was a ball.